Hey, folks, welcome to Deuteronomy chapter 20 through 24. This is probably the hardest section in our reading yet for me, just because there's so much that seems so foreign to us. It's out of our kind of realm of how we tend to think about things, and where it's just evident that we're in a different world here. We're in a different time and place, and a very different circumstance. So these chapters that we're in today are just various laws um, that cover all kinds of different things, and some of them are lovely. Some of them are really hard for us to understand. Some of them seem really maybe odd to us, or confusing, or harsh. And there's a lot. I guess I feel as much anywhere here that it's like each one of these things like needs like some research time to really understand what's going on here, like what. So just a couple kind of broad thoughts before I look at a couple of examples here. Just sort of keep in mind like a difference. So in this setting, like this is a nation. So a lot of these laws are like ways that they're going to govern themselves as a nation. So this is different for us. Like today, right? Like if we're Christians, it's our way of life. It's a faith, but we are there's Christians in all kinds of different countries with all kinds of different laws. And in a lot of places, at least, there's courts, there's jails, there's a legal system, there's police, there's all kinds of things. There's courts and juries, at least in the United States, all these kind of things. And so people that live in our country of all different, beliefs, faith, no faith, whatever, live in the same country, in the same laws, in the same system. But this is different here in the setting that we're in. So the people now are going in to be their own nation. They're not a people now living in Egypt. They're not a people living somewhere else under someone else's rule. They're going to live in their own place. And so, how do you do that in that place, kind of knowing what they knew in their background, without police, without jails, without, kind of anything else? Like they have to be able to have ways, laws, rules to kind of guide how they live. How do they deal with disputes? How do they deal with problems, and these sort of things? And so we'll see, because of the way things were in that regard, that really either restitution had to be made for a wrong done, or kind of the best case with a bad situation, or if it was something really serious, it carried with it a death penalty at that time. There was no kind of simply punishment like we do, 10 years in jail, 5 years in jail, life sentence, that kind of thing. That wasn't an option. And so a lot of these things, are how they kind of had to go in that way. So it's interesting, if we at sometimes would say like, that seems weird, like that seems well, what would you propose? Which would be kind of interesting, sort of thing to maybe to think about, or maybe not. So again, it's different, and it's easy for us to maybe tune out here, because we're sort of like, well, this isn't our setting today. We live in other countries, again, where we practice our faith, but we don't necessarily kind of make the laws and that kind of thing, at least not directly. Ultimately, of course, we have at least in our country, we have votes and say and that kind of thing. So let's just take a look through some of these, and again, this, as much as anything, really calls out for more research. So, if you're really interested in this or wanting to make sense of this, picking up a Bible commentary on this book of Deuteronomy would be very worthwhile, because there's just a lot of things here that aren't going to, being in a different world, a different culture, different place. It's going to be hard for us to totally click in without really doing some work and some research. And I've just, this is such an area of weakness for me, as far as I've not spent the time and study with a lot of these laws to really have a good, a good grasp of them. But I do know that when I read or listen to Old Testament scholars who have done the work and done the time, it's not that the challenges in the wrestling goes away, but there's some things that kind of make more sense when you put them in their time and place. And also sometimes it's a challenge to translate the Hebrew of these ideas into English words that don't carry with it sometimes baggage that doesn't necessarily accurately communicate what's going on here. So I just say all that. Well, that's a lot of front end here. Just to say, if this really is an area of interest at some time in the future, go back and do some of the work, get some background information and stuff, and do some kind of research in there. And maybe I'll try to at some point compile some good resources that may be helpful for you to kind of look back and see some of that. So, interesting, a whole bunch of things in these 4 chapters, just kind of peppered in with different laws, some longer explanations, some very just quick things. In chapter 20, it's interesting. These are all kind of instructions about when you go out to war. So they're about to enter into this land that's occupied. Beginning of 20, when you come up to go to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an army greater than yours, do not be afraid, because the Lord your God, who brought you up out of Egypt again and again and again, right, will be with you. So it's not about them. And so let me read verse 4, make a couple comments about this. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies, to give you victory. Let's be careful to contextualize this, though, in that God's people here aren't just given a kind of carte blanche of whatever you want to do, wherever you want to go, whoever you want to fight against. I'm with you. We've already seen when they tried to do things that weren't what God said, they got wiped out, right? They get defeated. So God's calling them to a specific thing that relates to this promised land, this land that they're going into, that's going to involve, yes, combat, and that God is with them in that, because as we've seen, this is the promise given. As we've seen, the people in this land and their sinfulness has reached kind of boiling point, where so there's this dual thing of God fulfilling his promise to his people, as well as bringing judgment on the inhabitants of this land for their sinfulness. So that's kind of in the story how it's kind of rolling in here together. But a lot of the first half of chapter 20 is interesting, of exceptions, of people who aren't required to join the military, if you will, in these endeavors. So just a couple instances. So has anyone built a new house and not yet begun to live in it? Let him go home, or he may die in battle, and someone else may begin to live in it. Has anyone planted a vineyard and not begun to enjoy it? Let him go home, or else he may die in battle. Has anyone become pledged to a woman and not yet married her? Let him go home, or he may die in battle, and someone else marry her. So this is, I think, I don't know, to me this is kind of cool in a way, because it makes provision for certain. It's not like everybody does it no matter what. And some of these things don't even seem like that, like super like deep of a need. Like, did you just build a house? So like there's a concern, like you just went through all this work of like building this house, and then it's time to go. And he said, well, wait a minute, what if I die? I just spent all this time building this house. Another interesting thing in that is that, when God says, hey, I'll go before you'll have the victory in these things. And then it says, you may die. So even though they're in the things that God has called them to, they're kind of assured the victory. And yet the victory doesn't necessarily mean that nobody's going to die on the way to that. And then in verse 8, if anyone is afraid or faint-hearted, let him go home, so that his fellow soldiers will not become disheartened too. And then in verse 10, it's interesting in certain circumstances anyway. When you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace before before you attack it. And then in the in section verse 16 and following, is that kind of relates to the taking of the promised land, if you will. Joshua will give us a chance to really think about this, and it becomes, when it actually is kind of going down, and we'll kind of spend the most time talking about what's all going on in there at that time. So kind of, if you think I'm kind of short selling this now, just wait. We'll get to it with Joshua. We'll spend some more time there. But the reason given here in the text that they have to kind of wipe everybody out, it is not because, in this, I'll stick to what actually is said right here in this particular passage of scripture instead of bringing everything else into play. Otherwise, verse 18, otherwise they will teach you to follow all detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. So it's not necessarily about just a people not being liked or whatever, but it's the influence that they're going to potentially be towards idolatry that's at the core, right, of the challenge and the problem that's going on here. Chapter 21 starts with what if somebody's found that's been unsolved mystery, a cold case, like the Bone Show or something like that. What do you do? And there's this whole process for, when there's no DNA and all that kind of stuff like we have today. They can't, figure out who committed a crime. There's still a process for atonement, because innocent blood has potentially been shed, and atonement needs to be made for the community, which again is interesting. We have both sometimes individual circumstances, but also those things affect the larger community as well. There's both an individual and a bigger picture collective thing that's going on here in these laws. And then so into chapter 21, verse 10. When you go to war against your enemies and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands, you take captives. If you notice among the captives a beautiful woman and you are attracted to her, you may take her as your wife. This is, all these things just need a whole time to really talk about, to give any kind of justice to, because we tend to read backwards from kind of where we're at, and these things look really kind of barbaric, to us, to our modern sensibilities. But when you go back in time and you kind of realize what the situation on the ground is, what's the future look like for a woman whose husband has been killed in battle and doesn't have a family or a home to go back to, what is she going to do? What are her options? And this I think, and I'm kind of, don't go here heavy on me if you whatever, because I'm sure I'm missing things, but I'm just kind of like wrestling with this, kind of a little bit throwing out some ideas here, and I'm sure I'm missing things. I'm sure there's more to think about, and it's difficult no matter what. It's not like it's just like, oh, this is great. This is like what this woman dreamed of happening to her. But I do want you to see that there's provision being made here, even within really a tragically difficult circumstance for this woman. So this, I guess, hypothetical in this in this case, it's not a specific person named here in mind, but her husband or father, all are dead. They're gone. There's no more kind of support system for her. And typically in the history of kind of warfare, what people would do with somebody in that situation is they would either be raped or abused or a better circumstance, maybe would become like a concubine or something like that, just to kind of be used by someone. And that's not what's being said here. You may choose to take her as your wife, right? So all the things that would then apply to a wife any other way would apply to this woman. And again, I'm not going to get into all the details. There's things that can be known and understood about the possibilities of why to shave the head and trim the nails and those kind of things, and the clothes. But look at some of the provision made here as well. After she has lived in your house and mourned her father and mother for a full month. So wow, this like enemy person now being incorporated into your family is given a month to mourn the situation. That seems to me significant. Then you may go to her and be her husband, and she shall be your wife. If you're not pleased with her, if you don't want her to be your, I guess a month is enough time to get to know somebody, their personality and stuff. If you don't want to be her husband, let her go wherever she wishes. She's not a slave. She's free. You must not sell her or treat her as a slave, since then you've dishonored her. So, interesting wrestling with really situations that are foreign to us and seem really difficult, and yet I think we can see some provision being made for the humanity and the care of somebody, even in this particular circumstances. So I feel like a lot of these laws, so that go on, like the right of the, and I can't go this slow because I'm going to take forever again, like the right of the firstborn. This whole context of all these laws are very clearly, I think, not utopia. This is not like let's redo Eden and this is what it looks like. That's not what's going on here at this part of salvation history. It's these are a people, remember where they've been. These are people that do not understand even hardly the basics of following God. These are people that live in the midst of the world that they live in, the ethics that they're used to, and idolatry is everywhere. These are a fallen people. They're a sinful people. And there's kind of within this messed up now world that we live in, that God is working in, leading us somewhere else. Here's where we're at this point, kind of moving forward. And it, has built in this assumption of, less than ideal marriage circumstances. And so we've got to kind of think about that God works with less than ideal situations without just saying, no, it has to be perfect. Genesis very clearly says in chapter 2, right, gives us this kind of marriage foundation. Jesus picks up on that. Jesus does not go back to this when he talks about the foundation of marriage. Actually, in here, we read about the certificate of divorce. Remember when they go to Jesus and say, hey, Moses, let us write a certificate of divorce. And he says, Moses did that. I'm paraphrasing a little bit here from memory. Moses did that because your hearts are hard. But in the beginning, it was not so. So that, to me, is a great interpretive key for this section of Scripture. This is not God's perfect, ideal situation. This is working with them where they were at. So, right, and to kind of, okay, given this situation, what are we doing right now? I think in particular, Jesus, what Jesus does there, I think kind of gives us a little bit of a paradigm to kind of think about that, and that also relates to creation ideal, what's now going on in the new creation, the kingdom that we live in, that will ultimately come to fulfillment later, kind of in the big picture. So we always have to ask ourselves when we're dealing with any particular passage of Scripture, where are we at in the story? Where are we at in the big picture? We're not at the finish line. We're very much in the messy middle here along the way. So if a man has two wives, well, wait a minute. Why are you saying if a man has two wives, a man can only have one wife? Well, yes, that is that is the creation ideal. That is God's preference. And yet we have provision made within that for, okay, this is the reality on the ground right now. How are we going to work with it? And if this is like so much I could talk about. Let me keep moving. But basically, there's provision made for, hey, if you have a favorite, you can't kind of shift your the rights of one to another because you have a favorite wife here. Rebellion against your parents is a capital offense. Very serious stuff. Let's look at some chapter 22. Something more just, I think, completely positive and easier to understand for us. Chapter 22. If you see your fellow Israelites' ox or sheep straying, do not ignore it, but be sure to take it back to its owner. So there's no finders keepers here in ancient Israel, and there's no it's not my problem, right? When you see someone else's animal property, livelihood, you should take responsibility for it. Back to the Cain and Abel. Am I my brother's keeper? Yes, you are. Because we could also say, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If you lost your ox or whatever, and your neighbor found it, would you want them to just say, oh, whatever, it's not my problem? Or would you want them to say, hey, let me take care of this, and so you can get it back, right? Pretty evident stuff. And some protection things for look at the scope of care, even for the ongoing provision of not only people, but just the whole land and even the animal world to a certain extent here. We have shown chapter 22, verse 7. If you come across a bird that's sitting on either its young little bird or eggs, wow, there's a law for that. You can't just say, ooh, eggs and meat. It says, do not take the mother with its young. You may take the young, or so you can take the baby or the eggs, but not the mother. I think the idea is so that the mother can continue to produce more eggs. So it's like perhaps both a concern for even the animal kind of world here, if you will, and as well for the future, not just in the moment. What's the most I can have right now, but what leads to long-term sustaining kind of maintenance stuff. When you build a new house, make a parapet around your roof, little kind of fancy wally thing, so that you may not bring the guilt of bloodshed on your house if someone falls from the roof, right? Because you didn't. So, how do we think about that and apply that? It would be an interesting thing to kind of think about. And then you have the not two things, not two kinds of clothes, two kinds of material, not two kinds of seed. And I think this is sort of like the food laws in that the be separate, the separation, not the mixing, that relates to how God wants his people to live, not mixed in with the values and the idolatry surrounding them, but to have a clear identity as his people. The marriage violation stuff tries to discern between adultery and false accusation, and so I think that is important. There's a lot in there to kind of think about. And then there's accusations against things like rape and adultery and that kind of thing at the end of chapter 26. And this is really a good one to dig some more into, to think about. And there's a lot that you need to do and there's certain things too, like so chapter 22 verse 28 is one of those things that, like, sometimes like atheists or like super skeptics will bring up and be like, look, this is how terrible the Bible is, but there's some translation issues here, and there's a really good on all this section. I would really recommend an interview with a great Old Testament scholar named Sandra Richter. She's got a great book called The Epic of Eden, which is not about this specifically, but about understanding the whole Old Testament. But she's got a great podcast interview where she talks about several of these things in these couple chapters, and this one in particular, because it's not all is not kind of as it seems on the surface here with that. There's a lot. It's as much about provision for women in difficult circumstances as it is about putting them in bad circumstances. But it's difficult if we're not careful in kind of how we read this here. So I don't want to keep talking for too long today. What else do I want to talk about? Let's look at the end of chapter 24. Well, I'm just gonna conclude this here. Again, the struggle that I'm having here is that what I really want to do is take one of these sections at a time and really spend the time to do the little bit or more of research that's needed to really understand it, because we can be so easily pulled off track if we don't dig in. This section in particular, really to understand, is going to require research and work. And I don't want to kind of make a false impression that once you do that, everything just clicks into place perfectly and you're like, oh, it's all so perfect and I love it. That's not necessarily the case. But when we do that, we start to kind of gain some perspective. We start to see a picture of the realities of the ancient world. So in particular today, as we maybe think about coming back in the future and kind of wrestling with some of the particulars here, think about the big picture again that I mentioned earlier. Where are we at? What's God doing in the midst of this? How is it has to work as a country and kind of all these things. So this really is the section of this kind of hard stuff. Some of that was in Leviticus, some of it here, and then we're kind of moving on now in Deuteronomy to some different stuff. Now we're going to see we're going to have to think about the violence and the conquest narratives in Joshua some more. We will do that in Joshua. We'll kind of jump headlong into that and kind of see what we can find out in there. So hope you guys have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow as we continue in Deuteronomy. Bye.